Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the World History Encyclopedia Lecture Series. My name is Harrison Mark. Today, I am joined by Ian Richardson, who is the Senior Treasure Registrar at the British Museum, where he has worked since 2007. He has an MA in Cultural Heritage Studies from the Institute of Archaeology, University College London. Ian has a particular interest in post-medieval small finds, and he is the co-author with Michael Lewis of the book Beneath Our Feet, Everyday Discoveries Reshaping History. Ian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Harrison.
And whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen, for taking an interest in the archaeology of Britain. As Harrison said, we've got a new book that's come out this year that celebrates finds made by members of the public in Britain and their contribution to archaeological and historical knowledge. As Harrison mentioned, I'm the Senior Treasure Registrar at the British Museum, and Michael Lewis and I both work on a program called the Portable Antiquity Scheme, which has a facet of administering the law of treasure in the United Kingdom. So this book really sprang out of our work on this program over the last 25 years, in Michael's case. And so what I'll do in introducing it is to tell you a little bit about the background and the context of what we do at the British Museum and our everyday work, and then go into some of the stories that are touched on in the volume. Hopefully don't give away too much to entice you to buy a copy and read some yourself. And then we'll just round it up at the end, and there'll be an opportunity for a few questions. So we work on something called the Portable Antiquity Scheme, which is a program managed by the British Museum in England and Amgueddfa Cymru, the National Museum Wales in Wales. It's a partnership program with over 100 partners in those two countries that employs local archaeologists called finds liaison officers to record discoveries made by members of the public onto a database that is accessible by anyone, researchers, students, just generally interested members of the public. This is because the United Kingdom and England and Wales in particular have a very liberal approach to public searching for archaeology. Generally speaking, you can look for any archaeology with any tools you like, including a metal detector, as long as you have the permission of the landowner, which is essential, and that you avoid something called a protected site, a scheduled ancient monument, where it's not allowed to do any sort of disturbance at all. Outside of that, essentially, what is found in the ground is the property of the landowner, except in the case of finds that are designated as treasure, and we'll come on to that in a little bit. Now, metal detecting has increased in popularity as a hobby since probably the 1970s, especially, and in recent years it's ballooned, and we've got tens of thousands of people, for instance, who are registered with some of the organizations that represent detectorists. And whilst only a small portion of the finds that are made by members of the public have to be reported, there's a recognition that this act of removing material from the ground is, as any archaeology, destructive to the record. And there is really only that moment in time that you have to try to capture that information about this material and record evidence of its discovery. Crucially, we want to know precisely where things are being found, because it is that geolocated information which helps inform us about past activities. And so the Portable Antiquity Scheme was set up in 1997 as a pilot scheme, initially in 6 counties in England, And then in 2003, it became a nationwide scheme covering all of England and Wales, where people can go on a voluntary basis to their finds liaison officer, bring material to them for identification, and then recording onto this database at Finds.org UK. So in order to do that, the finders need to provide a precise location of exactly where something was found so that it can go onto our map and be made publicly available. The information that's been recorded on the Portable Antiquity Scheme since 1997, now we have more than 1.8 million objects recorded there. This information has allowed for hundreds of research projects, including PhDs, postdoctoral research projects, and other investigations, which have revealed lots of new information about the landscape, particularly looking at coin data and analyzing where lots of coins, not necessarily hordes of coins, but individual coin finds have been plotted, allows us to speculate on where there were Roman settlements, for instance, that we didn't know about before, medieval fair sites. Those are just two examples. And part of the reason for that is because a lot of the formal archaeological work that goes on in the United Kingdom now is developer-led, or it's research-led by universities. And the developer-led archaeology is, of course, where new buildings are being constructed, and there's a requirement that archaeologists have to go and either investigate the site or do what's called a watching brief, where they will be on site as the excavation of the new property takes place, and then they'll log anything that comes up. And so that obviously happens in particular areas of the country where development's occurring. And then academic excavations will be based on research of particular topics and where they think there's an area of activity. Metal detectorists, on the other hand, are often driven to investigate areas based on the availability of the land that they can go on. Those are often farmers' fields that are under cultivation, where there may not be any record of previous occupation or previous land use. And so metal detectorists are, in a way, chancing their luck and seeing what's found there. So the finds that come up from their activities are filling in empty spots on the map from the other known archaeological finds that are made and really complementing those. And so it is really important that this information is recorded somewhere and made available for posterity. And the Portable Antiquity Scheme is the place to do that. But like I said, that is only voluntary for most things. There's no legal requirement unless the object is, the find is treasure. Now, the treasure definition serves to protect the most important discoveries made in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We have something called the Treasure Act, which was introduced in 1996. Scotland has a completely separate regime called Treasure Trove, and it applies to essentially all archaeological finds. And in Scotland, all these finds belong to the Crown and they can claim anything. In England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, it's much more limited. The Treasure Act applies to single objects made of gold or silver that are more than 300 years old, 2 or more precious metal coins, 10 or more base metal coins from the same find, prehistoric assemblages, so finds from the Bronze Age or Iron Age, pre-Roman, that are made of any sort of metal, but there has to be more than one object found together, and any prehistoric object that has even trace amounts of precious metal in it. And so essentially it is very precious metal based, aside for those prehistoric finds. There is an extension to that, which I will come on to when I'm talking about one of the stories in the book. But the treasure items that are found constitute a small portion of what a typical metal detectorist, say, would discover. However, the principle is that because they're normally precious metal or they're these prehistoric assemblages, they are in theory the more important finds. And anything that is designated as treasure belongs not to the finder or the landowner, but to the crown. And there's a legal obligation for the finder to report it within 14 days of discovery or 14 days of realizing its treasure. And that enables then a museum to acquire it from the crown to safeguard the find for the future. If that happens, then the finder and landowner are typically provided with a reward by the Secretary of State, and that reward is normally equal to the market value of a find. So what a find would be worth if it was taken to auction, for instance. So now some of these finds that have been reported treasure have been valued, and they're valued by an independent committee. They've been valued in the millions of pounds. So this is a big reward that some people have achieved. But it is very rare. I'm really privileged that I get to deal with this stuff all the time because my team and I administer the treasure process. But it's the find of a lifetime, essentially, if a detectorist were to find something like this, a hoard of early post-medieval coins that are in this picture. And the Treasure Act, we think, has been very successful because it's seen important finds acquired by over 250 museums in England and Wales over the last 25 years. And it's ensured that we've kept those finds available for the public and in this country. But there have been some loopholes because it is based on the composition of the artifacts and not necessarily their archaeological or historic importance as yet. There have been some finds that have been thought to have been really important but have fallen outside of the treasure remit, and we'll talk about that in a moment with the book. But this is just a quick oversight of the work that we do and the sort of stuff that we see. I'll go into the first story. This involves a Bronze Age gold vessel that was discovered in a place called Ringlemere in Kent in 2001 by detectorist Cliff Bradshaw. Cliff is pictured here on the left. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but he was a long-time detectorist in this particular area of Kent, and he was looking for Anglo-Saxons. He had a theory that the area that he was targeting had been used by Anglo-Saxons in the past. And he came across this fantastic discovery one day. Initially, didn't understand what it was, thinking perhaps it was some sort of Victorian light fitting. But he took it home and started looking in his books that he had there, and quite quickly realized it was something much older and more significant. He contacted them, the Portable Antiquity Scheme, and at the time, my co-author, now head of the scheme, Michael Lewis, he was the finds liaison officer in Kent. So he took the phone call from Cliff and had this object described to him over the phone. When he went down to Cliff's house to pick it up, Cliff built up the suspense quite a bit by showing him a few of his other ordinary finds that he'd been making that day. And Michael was sitting there, drumming his fingers on the table, waiting for the big reveal. Eventually, Cliff opened his ice cream container, and this massive cup emerged from it, which is, about as big as a big 16-liter, 16-ounce can of soda. But it's crumpled. Michael immediately, recognized it was extremely important, and he brought it up to the British Museum right away, where it was studied by the curators and scientists here. It's a rounded bottomed vessel from about 1900 to 1700 years BC. It's got these striations around it in very regular form, and it's got a handle attached to the back that you can see has these lozenge-shaped rivets holding it on. It's almost without parallel in Britain, although there is another cup that is in the collection of, it's in the royal collection, but on loan, long-term loan to the British Museum. It was found in a place called Rilliton in Cornwall. In that case, the cup is flat-bottomed, but we suspect it's because either the person who found it in the 1700s or one of the royal family to whom it was claimed, because it belonged to the Duchy of Cornwall, flattened the bottom to be able to keep it on their mantelpiece. So we think originally it may have been rounded on the bottom as well. And the purpose of that probably was that it was some sort of communal vessel that you could pass around in a ceremony, perhaps, where multiple people would drink from it, and there would be some sort of mystical happening that took place as you imbibed of the liquid within. There are other parallels on the continent as well, but they're still very, very rare. And it's amazing that it's so well preserved after so many years. One way of trying to contemplate how old it is that it is almost as many years before the birth of Christ as have been since Christ's birth. So it's almost 4,000 years old. And aside from this massive dent in it, it's virtually in pristine condition. And that dent is actually left by a farming implement. The local archaeologist in Kent who investigated the site, Keith Parfitt, he believed that he was able to narrow down precisely the farm equipment that was responsible for causing that damage. But this illustrates another aspect of this topic, which is that metal detecting can be beneficial because it can save some archaeological finds that are in the plough soil, that are inland, that is under cultivation, because they're under threat from being ploughed up and destroyed, basically, sometimes by farm equipment, sometimes by fertilizers, for instance. And so this dent, which is still in the cup, it hasn't been reshaped in any form as it's gone on display at the British Museum. It displays the modern history of the object and helps tell us why it's useful for metal detectors to go out and do their hobby if it's done responsibly. So because Cliff was able to report the find exactly where it was made, it led to this major excavation on the site where they found more Bronze Age artifacts. And then on top of that, they did find the Anglo-Saxons that Cliff suspected had been there. There was a big Anglo-Saxon cemetery, and the excavations therefore revealed a settlement pattern stretching over almost 3,000 years of a piece of land which held significance for multiple peoples, and which we didn't know would have existed if it hadn't been for Cliff. The cup has been on display at the British Museum, but also it's gone on and featured in many shows around the country and around the world. Most recently, it was at a big blockbuster exhibition at the British Museum on Stonehenge, where there were some other treasure finds as well. But the usefulness of the Treasure Act, of course, and putting these finds into museums is it makes them available for things like this, redisplay, further exhibitions. And so it's a great story. Now, the next one that's we talk about in the book, this is something that it relates back to what I was talking about with the definition of treasure. Now, this was a Roman cavalry helmet that was found in 2010 in Cumbria, a place called Crosby Garrett, by a father and son detecting duo who are remaining anonymous. You can see in the reconstructed version on the right that it is a very powerful object which has an immense presence to it. It's one of only 3 Roman cavalry helmets of this type that's known from Britain. another is in the collection of the British Museum from a place called Ribchester in Lancashire. And then there were some more fragmentary ones from a place called Newsteads in Scotland. But this is one of the better preserved, and also the only one dating from probably the 3rd century. It's also one of the most striking examples from all of Europe, and it would have been used in cavalry displays, not in battle, but as a way to impress the onlookers and the crowd. The face would have been highly polished silver, and so would have stood in contrast to the bronze top of the helmet, the curls, and the Phrygian cap, and then it's got the little griffin on top. And when it was found in 3 pieces. So you can see here on the left, there's the face piece with the front bit of the hair, and then the pieces of the cap below it, and then the griffin was separate as well. It's an astounding object. It was reported to a fines as an officer, and the landowner did permit a limited examination of the fine spot, but there wasn't any other context there. The shame of it is, from our point of view, that although it's an incredible find, it didn't meet the criteria for treasure because it's made of base metal. So although there is a little bit of silver on the front of the face, it's not 10% silver. It's just a silver sheen. Therefore, the finder and landowner didn't have any requirement to hand it in under the Treasure Act, and they could do with it what they wanted. And their decision was to take it to public auction and sell it. And in the course of that, they took it to the auctioneers Christie's, who restored it quite sympathetically. And so it looks fantastic now, but the level of restoration that it underwent was something that a museum wouldn't have done. The museum would have preserved it as it was found, because that's part of its story, and would have allowed future people to investigate it more thoroughly. So it went to this auction, and at quite short notice, Tully House Museum, the local museum in Cumbria, managed to raise a huge amount of money to bid on it, over £1.5 million, mostly through public subscription. But nonetheless, that wasn't enough, and an anonymous buyer outbid everyone else on it, and it went to them. And to this day, we don't know who owns it. We just know that it hasn't left the country because there hasn't been an export license granted for it, but it's a very closely guarded secret who owns it. Thankfully, that person has made it available for some exhibitions, like this one at the British Museum alongside the aforementioned Ribchester helmet. But the fact that it's subject to their whims, and who knows what will happen when that current owner decides they don't want it anymore, or when they pass away, who they're going to leave it to, is very much a shame to us. And so there was this quite a big question at the time from a lot of people in the museums and heritage and archaeological world. Well, you have this law of treasure, which is supposed to safeguard the most important archaeological finds, but it doesn't safeguard something like this. And this then led to eventually a consultation on the definition of treasure, led by the government, which completed in 2021. And they issued a revised definition and a revised code of practice for the Treasure Act in 2023, which extended to any metal object that is more than 200 years old, and which provides an exceptional insight into national or regional culture, history, or archaeology. And so that's quite a subjective definition, and it's a big shift from this previous definition of treasure being only linked to the composition of the artifact, to being more broadly metal artifacts that have the potential to tell us much more about our past and are of extreme significance. Already, we've seen several finds reported under this new significance definition of treasure, and no doubt there will be some more. So there's a lot to celebrate in that. There were some who wished it could have been extended even further to apply to materials of any composition, not just metal objects, but one step at a time. The point is that if something like this were found today, there would be a requirement for it to be reported as treasure. The coroner ultimately, you may think strangely, but the coroner has a role in treasure dating back to medieval times. The coroner is the one who ultimately decides whether or not a find meets the criteria for treasure, but we think they would in something like this. Now, two more finds, and skipping ahead a few more 100 years, we have this massive hoard of Anglo-Norman silver pennies that were found in the southwest of England in 2019 by a gentleman called Adam Staples here and 6 of his metal detecting friends. They went out to test some metal detectors just to try to decide if they were new ones they wanted to take on. And they started discovering all these signals. And quickly they realized when they dug them up that they were onto something important. It was a weekend, so they tried to get a hold of Finds Liaison Officer and local archaeologists, but it was very difficult, obviously. They managed to speak to someone who gave them advice about keeping the coins together as much as possible. Ideally, in a case like this where you've discovered a hoard in the ground, it is best to stop digging and wait for archaeological help. But they weren't able to do that because it was close to a public footpath, and they were worried that others had seen them making these discoveries, and if they left the coins there that were in the ground, that they would be excavated illegally by someone after they'd left. So they felt the best course of action was to take everything out of the ground themselves, which they did as best they could, and bagged them all up and brought them to the British Museum the next day to be cleaned off by our conservators. As I say, it would have been ideal for archaeologists to be able to see the relationship of these coins together in the ground, because even if they have been dispersed by the plow, which they seemingly were, there might have been some better understanding that we could have had about how they'd been deposited and whether certain mints had been placed together. Would have given a bit more insight into the monetary use at that time. The coins are from a really tight period in history, from just before the Battle of Hastings, 1066, to just a couple of years after. So there's one coin of Edward the Confessor, but almost all of them are coins of either Harold II, Harold Godwinson, and of course he only reigned in 1066 and only for less than a year, and his successor, William I. Now, the number of coins that we have from single finds of Harold I recorded with the Portable Antiquity Scheme numbers in the low hundreds, but there were over 1,500 of these coins in this hoard, to give you some idea of the scale of this discovery. And it was there were more than 2,000 coins of William in this hoard. So it's an incredible amount. The fact that Harold was able to issue the dies to the many moneyers scattered around England in the short period that he reigned, and to have had so many different moneyers making his coins, says something about the efficient monetary bureaucracy that they had even at that time. So we don't know exactly why this hoard of coins was buried in the Chew Valley. Judging by the date of the latest coins from William, it was probably in about 1067 or something like that. And of course, it's a reminder to us that the Battle of Hastings, 1066, wasn't a immediate watershed where one day there was Anglo-Saxon rule in England, and then the next day after the battle, it was all Norman rule. of course, Harold had died, and of course, William proclaimed himself king, and many people went to his side. But it wasn't a smooth transition. There were many who contested that, and there were some rebellions. Most famously, a little later on, in the north of England, which led to an increasingly frustrated William sending men there to really scour the countryside, and led to the harrowing of the north, where many people were killed. But at this time in 1067 in the southwest, it seems like some of Harold's sons came back and led a rebellion, particularly in Exeter area, trying to overthrow William, but they were obviously unsuccessful. And this hoard could have been buried as a result of some of that unrest at that time. We don't know exactly. There's a lot more that can be done to contextualize it and compare it against other of these other coin finds that we know about. But from a museological point of view, the good thing is that this hoard was classed as treasure. It was acquired by the Museum of Somerset, which is in Taunton in Somerset. The coins are very collectible. So when they were valued by the Independent Treasure Valuation Committee, the value of the whole hoard was £4.3 million. And this was a huge amount of money that the Museum of Somerset, Southwest Heritage Trust is the organization that manages them, had to raise. They were able to, thankfully, through a big grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, so people who play the lottery here in Britain contributed to that, and other organizations like the Art Fund and local benefactors. So the coins were subject to a big press event at the British Museum, and they went on display in a display case at the British Museum last year. And then they'll be in the Museum of Somerset on display there soon. But they're safeguarded now, not only for public enjoyment, but for further research, which is a good outcome. The last little story that I want to share is more of an unusual one because it wasn't found by a detectorist. It was found by a group of people who were digging a frog pond in their garden in a North London area called Hackney, the London Borough of Hackney. They came across this glass jar, which when they opened it up and took out the wax paper, they discovered 80 gold American coins called double eagles. These coins are massive in size. They're, well, I would say they're about 4 times as big as a sovereign, but it's probably easier just to say they're 32 ounces, and they're really heavy. They were minted in their millions in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So they're not incredibly rare in terms of collectible coins, but they have a lot of pure gold bullion in them. They have a high percentage of gold. The ones in the hoard were dated from the 1850s up until 1913 was the last minted. And it was a mystery as to why they were there, because the property was fairly new. It had been built in the 1950s. And there'd been a lot of people who'd lived there since 1913. There were various theories about why they were there. Maybe it was some American servicemen who'd come over during the First World War and buried the coins and then didn't come back. But an expert analyzed the jar and said that it was more likely the jar was a little bit later in date, maybe from the 1930s. And we tried to look into the evidence of why the coins were buried. The local finds liaison officer at the Museum of London was the one who took them in and organized this excellent photography of them. And they spoke to colleagues as well to search their archives for evidence of use of the property, but there were too many people to track down. So the coroner, who opened up an inquest into this case, made it a public appeal to anyone with information to come forward about why the coins were there. You see, there was a possibility they could be treasure, even though they were fairly recent in date, and that's because they would have applied under an old common law of treasure trove, which stipulated that discoveries of more than 50% precious metal, which had been placed in the ground with a deliberate intention of future recovery, and which had no known owner, could be classed as treasure trove. So in this case, the coins are over 50% precious metal. They were seemingly buried with the intention of someone coming back to retrieve them, but the owner was unknown. And so the question for the coroner was, could we trace the owner? Well, thankfully, someone did come up with something. They discovered in the Times, that's the London Times, archive, evidence of a coroner's inquest in the 1950s of a very similar discovery in Hackney of 82 gold coins. And those coins have been claimed by a person called Martin Sulzbacher. And Martin's story is quite remarkable. I don't want to go into it too much, but basically he was a German Jewish refugee who'd escaped that country just before Kristallnacht in 1938, and he came to North London. During his time in North London, when the war seemed to be going quite poorly for Britain and threat of invasion of the Germans was high, anyone who was classified as an enemy foreign agent was subject to internment, similar to the way that Japanese Americans were interred during the Second World War. And so Martin was sent to the Isle of Man initially, and then to Australia, to an internment camp there, basically to prevent him from, in theory, being someone who could help invading Germans, even though obviously he was one of the last people who would do so. But at the time, there was this concern that anyone with German ancestry could be a threat. So he was removed to Australia. During that time, some of his extended family were living at this property in North London, and they were tragically killed in the Blitz. When Martin eventually was returned back to England because there was a reassessment of the threat level that he provided, and so he was able to return home. He found that his house had been destroyed. He'd heard about the death of his family, but he also discovered then that much of his material wealth, which he'd managed to smuggle out of Germany, his family had buried, but it was impossible to recover it because it was covered in a huge amounts of rubble, even though we hired people to try to look for it. So he gave up on it. It was only in the 1950s when the government bought out the land that he, and it was cleared that someone discovered this first jar of 82 gold coins. When he heard about the discovery then, and the coroner held an inquest at the time, he came forward. The coroner believed his story, accepted his evidence, and gave the coins to him. And so seeing that connection led us to believe that, that was too much to be coincidental. And we were able to trace in the archives evidence of Martin's story, his internment card, and other newspaper articles about this, and also reach out to his living family. So he had a son who was still alive, Max Sulzbacher, and Max was able to come forward and provide more details of Martin's story with us, which matched up with all the information that we had. And this was all presented to the coroner, who agreed that the Sulzbachers were the rightful owners of these coins and awarded them to them. And although there are many tragic elements to this story, of course, the fitting end to it is that Max gave a small reward to the finders of the coins in 2007, and he gave one of the coins and the jar and the packaging material to Hackney Museum to be used as an exhibition about immigrants, about the Second World War, about treasure law. And then he sold the rest of the coins and used the money to repair some of the gravestones of his family that were in North London, and which had deteriorated over time. So there was some good that came out of it. But it was a fascinating story, not the typical sort of find that we get, but an example of the sort of thing that could come up any day in this job, where people are telling us about new finds all the time. And so there are many more stories in the book, which I hope you'll take the time to look into. And that's all I'm going to say for now. Leave it to Mark if he's got any questions. Harrison, sorry.
Well, thank you, Ian. That was very fascinating. Lots of very interesting stories in there, and of course, as he just said, if anybody watching is very interested, as much as I am, you can get their book. We're going to leave it in the description. But I guess all this begs the question: is how did the book come about? What drove you and your co-author Michael Lewis to write this thing?
Well, Michael's been working with the Portable Antiquity Scheme since about 2000. So 25 years he's been involved, and I've been doing it since 2007. So we have been really privileged to, as I said, be exposed to these fascinating stories, a wide variety of finds that have crossed our desks. And we wanted to find a way to celebrate the contribution that not professional archaeologists necessarily, but members of the public are making to our understanding of the past. These interesting stories that their finds can tell, but also the important information that they hold. But we also wanted to be able to give some insight into the depth of work that goes into these discoveries. So it's not as simple as someone finds something and they take it to an archaeologist or a museum professional who does a quick photograph and then gives it back to them or puts it in a museum, and that's it. There's a huge amount of work that goes into the recording itself, but also the investigation, the research into the objects themselves, but their context. And then there's the bureaucratic process of if something is being acquired by a museum, ensuring that it's fairly valued. The coroner's office, as I mentioned, is involved in determining legally whether or not it's treasure. And then there's the people who have to support the fundraising to ensure that these finds go into public collections. And Michael is an expert in the period of the Norman conquest, the Bay of Tapestry in particular. So it's exciting times for him. But and he did his PhD on that. But I'm just a generalist. I've been exposed to information and knowledge from lots of different periods, but I wouldn't consider myself a huge expert in any one particular find type or period. But we are really lucky being here at the British Museum that we have tremendous colleagues, both in the museum itself, but also in the wider Portable Antiquity Scheme, this network of finds liaison officers, but also local museum curators and just independent experts. And we were able to draw on their expertise in writing this book. And that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to be able to tell these fantastic stories, but ensure that they were that we weren't telling them inaccurately. So we drew on this network of people that we know and work with, and we're able to put together what we think is a good all-rounder that covers things from the Stone Age up through the present time, up until the Hackney Horde in the early 20th century, and get that input from the leading experts in Britain. And that's what we wanted to do to be able to produce the best volume possible.
Now, let's say that, well, first of all, let's say that I lived in the UK. Obviously, I'm an American, but let's say I did, and that I went out, I bought a metal detector. I was inspired by this book to maybe go search for some treasure on my own. What is the likelihood that I would find anything? Would you say it's more about luck in your experience, or more about strategizing? Okay, I think this is where there is an Anglo-Saxon settlement or a
Yeah.
Roman Britain settlement.
Well, it can be a bit of both. Some people who go out and search, they have been looking in the same area for a long time, or they've been studying the same area for a long time. They know the landscape really well. Of course, the act of plowing and cultivating the landscape, and also things like erosion and other natural processes, they um, they have the possibility of bringing new things to the surface all the time. So just because you've been over one area once doesn't mean that if you do it again, you're not going to find anything. But so these people who've been studying particular parts of the landscape for a long time, they often have a really good idea where they're likely to find something based on the topography, based on the natural features and what they can see. And they study things like Google Earth, but also more traditional maps, and also just go out and walk the landscape. But there is a big element of luck, obviously. And you know, we hear these stories all the time of people who are fairly new to detecting making these fantastic discoveries that you know, better than someone who's been searching for decades has. And I mean, I suppose that's for the detectorist, that is the thrill of it, is that you never know when you that signal that you get is going to turn out to be something fantastic. And that's the thing that I think fascinates a lot of people and gets a lot of people hooked.
Yeah, and now switching over, let's take the point of view of a piece of treasure. Let's say a coin, a Norman coin, for example.
Hmm.
I wonder if you could walk us through. Of course, you mentioned all this in your presentation, but just to give a concise sort of step by step of what would happen. This coin is found, it's dug up by a metal detectorist, and I wonder if you could walk us through where that coin would go from there to reach the British Museum.
Okay, yeah. So first of all, just really quickly, normally a single coin by itself, even if it was precious metal, wouldn't be treasure unless it was one of these coins that's classified under the significance criteria. And we have had one, is a single coin of the Viking ruler Guthrum, who was one of the first Viking rulers to convert to Christianity. And a coin of his was found in Norfolk in 2024 and classified as treasure. So a detectorist or a member of the public makes a discovery, and if they think it's treasure, they have this obligation to report it within 14 days. The legal obligation is to notify the coroner, but the way to do that is via the fines liaison officer in the area where they live. But they can also do it via the National Museum itself, either the British Museum or National Museum Wales. So they normally take it into their fines liaison officer, who will help confirm their suspicion as to whether or not it meets the criteria for treasure. And if they think it does, they'll take all of the necessary details from the finder. So his or her details, the landowner's details, as I mentioned, crucially, where precisely it was found in the land, and the date that it was found. And they'll record all that information, pass it to us at the British Museum, and we'll log it onto our system. And then they'll notify the coroner. And the next step is for a report on the item to be written by someone. Normally, that's the fines liaison officer themselves, but for more important fines, or if there's something unusual about it, it might have to come to the National Museum directly. So they would arrange for it to come to the British Museum, where a curator for that particular period would look at it and provide this descriptive report. But then there needs to be a decision made as to whether or not a museum wants to acquire it. In actual fact, the majority of material that meets the legal definition of treasure isn't claimed by museums. So therefore, the Crown disclaims its ownership of the find, and it goes back to the finder or landowner. So it's that minority of material which a museum thinks is important enough to be in their collection, where they express an interest in it. And then we ask the coroner to formally hold an inquest and declare it treasure. And if the coroner agrees and says it meets the definition of treasure, we arrange then for it to be valued by someone in the antiquities trade. who provides a valuation report to the Treasure Valuation Committee, another independent committee, who then uses that report as a starting point to debate their official recommended value for the find to the Secretary of State. Once they've done that, if the Secretary of State agrees with that valuation, then that's the amount of money that the museum has to raise to fund the reward for the finder and landowner. It's important to note that we're clear that the museum isn't buying it from the finder or landowner. The government's not buying it from the finder or landowner. It belongs to the government, and the finder and landowner are being paid a discretionary reward, which is normally equal to the market value of the find. But in cases of wrongdoing, that can be reduced if they haven't behaved properly.
I was particularly interested when you're talking about the Chew Valley hoard, about how that was buried during the time of the Norman conquest. Do you think, I guess this is a two-part question, are most treasures that you find intentionally buried, do you think? And for ones that are, such as the hoard, do you think they're more commonly buried around times of crisis, or are there other reasons that some historical person might bury a hoard of treasure?
Great questions. So the first one, no. In terms of most discrete discoveries are actually probably because something was lost unintentionally. Quite a bit of material, particularly from the medieval and later periods, but even earlier, they're probably what we'd call dress accessories or jewelry. So they're things they're metal bits that would have been used to fasten clothing together, or they're things like finger rings, which obviously could have slipped off a finger, or some sort of hair ornaments that could have slipped out of hair. And the reason why it's a good question is because this earlier common law of treasure, which we had here up until 1996, because of its particular requirement that material had to have been buried or hidden with the intention of future recovery, means that all of these things which we say were the product of a casual loss wouldn't have been classed as treasure. So that means you were missing out on a whole range of material that was just lost, all this jewelry and these dress accessories and things. But also, and this ties in with the second part of your question, there would have been things that were put in the ground, not necessarily for safekeeping, although definitely some hoards were put in the ground for that reason, but probably either as offerings or as grave goods, for instance. So probably the most famous archaeological find in England, anyway, is the Sutton Hoo ship burial, which was, amongst other things, subject to a Netflix film a couple years ago called The Dig. And that was found in the 1930s. And it's a fantastic collection of, amongst other things, gold and garnet jewelry, which was put in the ground as a burial along with this uncertain ruler at the time. And because it wasn't a hoard that had been put in the ground for safekeeping, although it was subject to a coroner's inquest in the 1930s at the time, the ruling was that it wasn't treasure trove because it had been deliberately put in the ground, but the intention was to leave it there. And so therefore, the only reason it's in the British Museum is because the landowner, Mrs. Pretty, gave it to the nation. And so this newer law of treasure that we have from 1996 rectifies that big loophole, which says that it doesn't matter why something was lost or how it ended up in the ground, whether it was lost or hidden for safekeeping or put in the ground as a funerary arrangement. It still qualifies as treasure if it meets this material composition threshold. But yeah, certainly there were quite a few coin hoards in particular that were hidden in times of turmoil. And well, the Hackney hoard itself was, we think, the reason why that the relatives of Martin Sulzbacher had hidden it is because they had heard stories of when the Germans successfully invaded the Low Countries, and in France, one of the first things they did is they went into these banks' safe deposit boxes, and they tore them open and they took away all the things that were in there. And that's where Martin Sulzbacher's gold was. So the family took it out of the safe deposit box and buried it in the garden for safekeeping, as people have been doing for thousands of years. And unfortunately, they perished and didn't come back for it. And it was only decades later that someone found it. So, I mean, that's a fascinating connection to human activity over millennia.
And a final question to wrap us up is, what has been your personal favorite find that you know of or have been involved with?
Gosh, yeah, that's tricky because, like I say, there have been so many. It's difficult to not say the Staffordshire Hoard, which is another one that's in our book, which is this fantastic collection of Anglo-Saxon gold and garnet martial related objects. So fittings from swords predominantly, and a few other objects that were found in the Midlands and Staffordshire in 2009, simply because of the huge mass of material, which was unprecedented, and the fact that it garnered so much public interest at the time, and the British Museum, which many people assumed would have been the place that would have wanted to acquire this hugely important hoard, decided that it was better to go to the local museum. So the Potteries Museum in Stoke-on-Trent and Birmingham Museum, they split acquisition of it. And, you know, to be honest, that's been a great thing, because both of those museums have used that as a catalyst to develop new galleries and drive visitor interest in not just those institutions themselves, but to the entire region, and to those in Stoke's sake, the city itself. And there's been a lot of local pride in this find. So, I mean, that's been really good to see, I think. So that's probably my favorite, but there's just so many. And like I say, we're really privileged that we get to see new finds every day. And I'm sure there'll be equally exciting things coming up soon.
Yes, and on that note, thank you very much for your lecture. We very much appreciate it. Again, Ian's book is Beneath Our Feet, Everyday Discoveries Reshaping History. That was written with Michael Lewis. The link to that will be in the description for everyone to check out, and I highly encourage you to do so. Ian Richardson, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Harrison. Really appreciate it. Take care, everyone.